This is a bonus episode of Dig Where You Stand. My name is Ben Schuman-Stoler.
I'm Peter Matthews.
We put out the first episode a couple weeks ago, and we're hard at work on the second episode, which will come out in another couple weeks. In producing the show, we talked to the filmmakers of a documentary that was shown first at the Berlinale, and which will hit theaters on the 23rd of May. We really enjoyed our conversation with the two filmmakers, Cece Mlay and Agnes Wegner. Mlay was in Tanzania, and Wegner was in Germany. We have so many good sources and interesting ideas that we want to share that can't fit in the episode. So this is an example of one of those conversations we want to share.
Yeah, we really enjoyed this conversation. I mean, one thing that keeps coming up in all the different people we speak to, and we're working on episode 2 right now, is how this story is sort of ongoing, it's still present. And that's one of the things I think this film really illustrated in lots of different ways, from like scenes where there's people teaching the history in classes, or people who experienced or whose ancestors experienced the event, or how it comes to Germany. In all different ways, this film like really brings home that feeling of the presence of this history. And so that's one of the things I really enjoyed about this conversation. So that's why we wanted to share it.
Yeah, so the conversation is about 30 minutes between me, Peter, Cece Mlay, and Agnes Wegner. If you haven't heard episode 1 of Dig Where You Stand, you might miss some of the references that we talk about here. So I will just quickly say Katja Coyle appears in a scene in the film. Katja Coyle is a Green Party member of a minister of the Foreign Office here in Germany. And it's a very moving scene. And we also talk about Karl Peters, who was the founder of German East Africa, today Tanzania, and a very cruel, violent, murderous man who was called the Bloody Hand by people in Tanzania. And we also talk about Humboldt Forum, which is a museum here in Berlin that exhibits objects taken from colonies, former German colonies, that was opened just a few years ago. So that should pretty much catch you up, and let's play the tape.
So yeah, thanks again for talking to us. I suppose maybe to start, people might say when they're talking about the subject that it's so long ago. I think one of the things that your film did was to sort of bring it into the present. Why do you think the story is relevant now? You know, if people are saying some of these people were killed 100 years ago, or these things are a long time ago, what made it contemporary for you?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's what it all comes down to, is that people have to understand, especially on the European side of this story, is that none of that is over. If a crime is committed that is that vast and inhuman and has such an immeasurable impact on societies, that this is not something that can be over after a decade or 2 or 6. You know, it will have traces that last for an extremely long time, over decades, over centuries, over generations, you know, such as we have discovered while we were making the film, that the pain that was caused to the communities that we talk to has been passed on from generation to generation. But then all of this being said, in this case, in our case, it is also far from being over, because let me make it very concrete. The things that were taken from Tanzania in that case, both cultural objects, religious objects, as well as human remains that were taken to Germany, are still here. So how can this be over when Germany is still holding on to human remains as well as objects that are so important for the communities that they were taken from? And it's far from being resolved.
We met 2 beautiful families who were really had already passed these stories on within themselves. And they had elders in both families who had very vivid recollections of things that were said either to their parents and passed on to them, or the fact that some of these families just had been in a state of having an open piece of ground so to speak, where there was not their relative where they should be. Because you also have to understand that the nature of most communities that are here in Tanzania, burials are a very sacred thing. Depending on obviously your religious background, most of our communities bury their family members at home in the grounds of the homes. And so for that proximity, it is sort of claiming that this person is part of this space, is part of this family, is part of this community. And we both wanted this to be a personal issue because it is a personal issue for these families. And, you know, both of us being women who have had that struggle of having personal and the political always being at a head, this was the best approach. Bring the people whose pain is very real and very tangible in a space in which it might be able to move people through these institutional and government spaces through the eyes of somebody whose humanity you're very close to.
That's really interesting. Another thing we'd like to hear more about, I think, is that kind of you touched on already there, which is, I guess, another way the story is kind of present is from the demands of the communities. And what does it mean to people? What does it mean to them to have these remains back, both materially, but also kind of symbolically, spiritually?
I'll go back to, for most communities here, our two families that we spoke about, because they do come from the south of Tanzania and the north of Tanzania. And their customs and traditions such that when a person passes away, each year you go and visit the grave of the person who has departed. And this has been a practice that is very common within those two communities. Now, for one of our families, it's a fact that they have a grave that is half empty because the skull of their ancestor is not buried where it should be. In the north, they are missing the person entirely. And so both of these communities don't have a place in which they can go and acknowledge, one, the fact that this person who was a member of their family is here. This is ours. This is somebody who we love. This is somebody who's part of our family. On the communal level, each funeral is attended usually by your neighbor. It is a custom, it's a practice, it's a tradition. They don't have a place in which to claim this history as well. Because in both of the cases of these two families, you're talking about two very notable resistance fighters. That's a part of history that's missing for the communities, for the nation. And so when we speak about it on a spiritual level, what it means for us, for Tanzanians, it is like you are missing a member of your family and you cannot claim that they were part of who you are as a family. For the community, they have no place to go and mourn a person who was a member of their community, who has formed this history that they're a part of. And so before anybody can speak about the more tangible, more material, I guess, processes that would need to happen in order to start the process of reconciliation, these communities need to have a sense that this person is here. And then from there, our traditions and the customs of those two communities allow for all of these other quote unquote material, which are important things to happen after they have been able to lay this person to rest.
But also there's this thing which I think it comes up is that people would also attribute misfortunes like climate change or poor crops or whatever to this kind of disturbance of their community, which is, you know, at the same time once like a real disturbance and a real massive shift which happened through the results of these actions, but also something kind of symbolic in the symbolic order. And I think in your film, people talk about that, saying something like, you know,
mental illness was mentioned, I think.
Yeah, again, just how present it is and how there was this feeling of like imminent possible resolution in a way.
Well, I think it's also them putting this idea of generational trauma in a language that is more accessible and understandable to them, because, and they were speaking about things that are on a familial level. Those are things that are close. When you're talking about, because they said people disappear in ways that we cannot explain, which is, if you think about it, that's a very moving thing for somebody to say. These things are having impacts on us directly. We cannot explain it because we are missing something here. This idea of an individual versus community does not, this is where I think those two things collapse very beautifully, right? Because in our film, we see Mshili. He is a very well-respected spiritual and cultural leader in his community for this specific family. And when he speaks about this thing, there is an authority, and it is understood within the community that these things affect us. We are all a part of this. And so it's a hard thing to explain, but they know that this is something that has been broken for them.
And I would just like to add, now that you mentioned Nchili Ernest, this amazing leader of his family, he himself has been through a very dangerous accident. He doesn't speak about it in the film, but you can see it. He has a scar on his head that you see whenever you see him in the film. And the story behind it is that this accident was so dramatic that he lost his wife in the accident. She died, and he survived it. Like you just said, Cece, about things that we cannot explain. He does mention, he said, like you said, he talks about people disappearing, but also accidents. And that always, strikes me to hear him talk about something that very, very literally happened to him, losing his young wife and barely surviving this accident, and then also looking for explanations and feeling that something is off and something is wrong and something is missing that has to be back. And the other thing that I would like to add to what you said, Cece, is that from a German or a European perspective, I think what is so important and in a way so healthy for us to hear is that things that went, or that, bad things that happened in the past and that have not been resolved do have an impact on our present and on our future. And we have talked to so many people who talked about this and said, we cannot move into a bright future if something that, a wrong that was done in the past has not been resolved, and there is no solution, there is no reconciliation, and it affects the future. How can we move on? And how can this future be good for any of our countries, any of our societies? And as Ernest Nchili also says, and that is something that is in the film, is that he says, this also has an effect on the people in Germany because they're involved in this. And how can they be truly happy if they're carrying this wrong, this enormous guilt with them, and they're not dealing with it?
No, I think that's really important. There's this kind of ignorance about a lot of it on the European side. And people say, oh, what do you mean there's human remains in Berlin? And then you look into it and then you sort of see this sort of subject leads in all these different directions. And I wonder how much you think after making the film that kind of European ignorance of its past, do you think it's an ignorance, or is it a sort of deliberate blindness in order to avoid responsibility?
Well, I definitely think it has a lot to do with the latter. You always have a choice. It's not just people not knowing, but it's a systematic neglect, let's say, at least neglect, but you could also call it different things. You could call it denial, or Germany has a choice as to what is being taught in our history lessons at school. This is not something that happens by accident. It's a very deliberate thing. And it's also a matter of priorities. We have this scene in our film where German school class talks about that precisely. These kids speak about why the history of German colonialism is not being taught at our schools. It's not part of our curriculum in the federal states. And it must be, it should be. And these kids are so smart, and they actually say that they think the reason behind this neglect is that how do they call it, Cece? They say it's too far away, right? They talk about, we're only being taught the historic events that feel or that seem closer to us. And then one of the kids says, Germany doesn't look beyond Europe. And I think that's very true.
And they speak about shame as well. And I think that's always a very interesting area to explore, this question of proximity to one's historical past, right? Because for people who have been part of the colonial project in terms of it was done to us, we have a proximity to our trauma. When you speak to those who were the colonizers, they can distance themselves from that history. And we have to ask ourselves why that is.
I appreciate that you mentioned the issue of distance and who is able to distance themselves and who isn't. I think it is very true, and I'm really grateful that you're bringing this up. And at the same time, the perpetrators, it seems as if this is over for Germany because they're not missing anyone. My point is that if I know that there are tens of thousands of heads, human heads in boxes, in basements, in my country, I find it hard to distance myself from that. I think if you're a truly empathetic person, it's very difficult to live with that knowledge and the fact that this is still taking place. And I think the fact why our kids in the school class reacted the way that they did is because they felt it in their hearts, how wrong this was and still is. This is why this whole topic of distance is so interesting and so important, because for them, they're less distant to what happened, not less than, but less than, many of the adults that are dealing with the topic. Yeah. And I think it's a matter of empathy, really.
I mean, talking about the families, there's this great scene with Catch a Coil when you've kind of got, because you've got these families looking for their lost relatives, and then you have another family in a way on the German side, and it kind of comes together in that way. It would be interesting just to know, because I think even before you go into it, just Cece, because you said, but here everybody knows who Karl Peters is. When did you first hear about him? What's his reputation there today?
For me, it was just because of where my father is from. We're from the Mount Kilimanjaro region. And we had a huge presence of Germans there. We were actually quite close to the Germans, unfortunately, from the tribe's perspective. But his reputation is well known throughout the region and the country because of the role that he played and how cruel that period of colonialism was for, I would say, a lot of communities. Because the interesting thing with Karl Peters, it's even like, folklore. You can go and joke about it. It's taught within your history classes here, but even on a community level for those who, and it's a bit fractious now with the current generation and the generation that precedes them. But you can go and have these discussions even in terms of like colloquialisms that are used within these communities. So his history had an impact, what happened with Karl Peters here.
I mean, our challenge is, the scene is amazing, right? But to somehow describe what was happening there and why it's such a meaningful moment in the film.
So there is this scene in the film where two of our protagonists, John and Cecilia from Songea in southern Tanzania, visit Berlin, and they end up having an appointment with a state minister in the foreign ministry, Katja Keul. And they're joined by two activists from Berlin, Mboro and Konradin Kunze, who work with them and who also take them to Katja Keul's office. And she was open enough and friendly enough to have a really long conversation with the four of them. I mean, the reason why they meet, of course, is John and Cecilia's search for the head of their ancestor, Songea Mbano. And towards the end of the visit, Katja Keul, without anybody mentioning it, Katja Keul very surprisingly says that she is not only committed to this issue as a state minister, but also personally involved. And then she says that she hasn't talked about this publicly, really, or that she doesn't mention it often, but that she has a perpetrator in her family. And she doesn't say the name of that family member. She leaves it at that. And the atmosphere in the room was that we were all just really surprised that she mentioned it without anybody asking. And we knew about this before she mentioned it. So we had heard about it. John and Cecilia didn't know of it, or at least not the name of the family member. But there was definitely a moment of surprise when she said it. But then when the group left her office and they walk through a hallway in the foreign ministry, Mnyaka Sururu Mboro asks John and Cecilia if they know who this family member of Katja Keul is. And they say that they don't know who it is. And then he says, it's Kai Peters. So that's the scene. And then for us, of course, it was then a question. We knew that we had recorded this. And then we thought, okay, this is something that we should actually include and put in the film, because it does add another layer to the story, to the person of Katja Keul, to her very dedicated work, and to, the whole relationship. And we did inform her, though, before the premiere, that name, even though she didn't say it, that it is included in the film. And she didn't have anything against it. So.
And I saw that in early March, she was just over there in Tanzania and announced that publicly. Does that change that scene for you, or does that change your understanding of her? I mean,
it might have changed it for her, but it seems like that's also possible. I mean, do you think it changed it for her?
Personally, I think yes, because, and this is also something that's addressed in the film. I think one of the things that also a lot of these communities, you have to understand, want is to meet a family member of a perpetrator so that they can address this issue with them about the pain that has been caused. But let me just say that for her, with the communities, it opens new opportunities in terms of her having a position as a minister, and also on the level as in these families now have somebody to address this with and say, hey, we would like for you now to come as yourself, as a representative of this family to these communities and say what you have to say. And then now that becomes a question of like the community being able to say these are the hurts, these are the wrongs. I think it's diplomatically, this could be a very interesting open avenue for her to be in a position where she will have to sit and listen first and foremost. And according to, at least for these two communities, their customs and traditions are that if a perpetrator goes because they have killed somebody in your family, there is a whole process and procedure that you have to undergo in order for the community to accept your apology for the wrongs that have been done. So I'm interested to know, as a Tanzanian personally, what's going to happen with it on that level. I think the fact that she's carrying this personally as well, and this is really where we began, I think that is a huge key to how you can even start this question of what this reconciliation can look like if everybody is open to the process being different from what it's been previously.
And this actually, it sort of like comes full circle with what we've talked about before with this question of being able to distance yourself. Because also what it shows that many of us have ancestors in some way or the other that were involved in all of this. And no matter whether they were some big, perpetrators on the continent or in Germany, making profit of what was happening there, in some way or the other, all of us here are involved. And I think this is one detail that her personal involvement also shows.
Just to add to that, you have to know that we went through 2 periods of colonization, went through the Germans and then the Brits. I can 1000% tell you, every single person you talk to in this country remembers the German period, and you were here for the shortest stint. But people remember because, unfortunately, of its cruelty and its impact on the communities. To me, that says a lot about even the exploration of this history. That to me has been quite shocking, to be honest, because even anecdotally, when you go and talk to friends about it, or you tell somebody what you're doing, everybody, at least people who are from, especially these communities and regions that were part of the Majimaji War or from the north, people have stories of, my grandfather, he used to have this weird story that he would tell us, and we're not quite sure, but they say that when the Germans were here, this and this happened.
Yeah, well, I suppose that there's another scene that really stayed with me was this talk, walking around with John and Cecilia when they walk into the Humboldt Forum, and they're looking at these cabinets of everything that was taken from the former ethnological museum or the ethnological museum that's there, and they say to each other something like, we were so rich, they're just looking at all this kind of stuff. Did they talk further to you guys about it, or how did they find that experience, or how was that to witness and kind of go through with them?
I think I'll just mention an anecdotal after the fact. I think, first of all, remember that this was their first time being outside the borders of our beautiful country. And the museum space, even for anybody who goes there, it's both beautiful but also intimidating and also hollow at the same time. But I remember them talking a lot about the space and also the fact that space was not back home, and talking about what they would imagine for a space like that being in Songea, actually. And they've been talking a lot about having a memorial in their own community for Songea and Bano. So, visually and personally, for them, I know that they understood the irony of that juxtaposition of the space and the things that were in there.
Yeah, I think you described it very well. I remember it as being very ambivalent, lots of mixed feelings, not just the visit at the Humboldt Forum, but also throughout their days in Berlin. And I think you described it beautifully. I mean, yes, they were impressed, and they, especially in the Humboldt Forum, I mean, they loved what they saw, but how can you love it when it's so painful to see it? This proximity of love and admiration, and then also the hurt that laid over them and over all of us and that space. So yeah, very, very, very ambivalent moment.
And how do you two, I mean, we won't go into all of the different complexities of it, but how do you two just feel about the Humboldt Forum itself as Berlin's latest, newest museum that's been kind of expensively rebuilt. How do you just feel about it as a place, as a symbol?
I think it is a great symbol for what is actually going on. It's a great symbol for denial. It's a great symbol for the continuation of a colonial perspective of racism, and so the Humboldt Forum, sadly, it's super problematic, and it's actually hard to find words to describe how I feel about it. It's a lot of anger that I feel, and it's also, I think it's a very shameful process, the whole, all of it. I mean, how it came into being and how things are being handled now.
Some people have said, yes, it's been tough. Yes, we've made mistakes. There's been a steep learning curve and understanding the importance of some of these ancestral remains. They've learned to say ancestral remains instead of, there's been a whole process in the language also over time. They have said, though, like, this is a process. We're maybe like in the beginning third of this process, but in 20 years, we won't be talking about this because we'll give it back. Do you see that possible? Or how do you imagine this playing out in the next decades?
Well, first of all, we do see the process. We do see the changes. Some of the people, the protagonists that we have filmed with that work in the institutions in Berlin have come quite a long way from when we started talking to them until today. Yes, you can hear it in language, but also, attitude and positions that we are moving forward in a good direction, I would say, even though, of course, everything takes very, very long, but there is a learning process. I do agree. At the same time, we are very nervous about, the political changes, because our government, when you think of people like Katja Koll, Bundespräsident Steinmeier, who went to Tanzania to meet the Songea Mbanu's family and made his historic apology. When you think of who will form the government after our next elections, that is something that fills me with concern and with fear personally, because I think what has been started in recent years and looks as if it's leading to, a better future is something that is, I think, very much endangered, depending on what our next government will look like.
And I think that's not too dissimilar with the situation here, because it is going to come down to the government of the day and their policies and what they're prioritizing. I think for the families here right now, where both their issues stand, especially when you look at the case of Lubulu Kaya, this is they know where the remains are, they know what the institution is, both the institution in Tanzania, which is the National Museum of Tanzania, and the American Museum of Natural History. Both of those institutions are the ones now who have to make this next step in making sure that this process happens. But that also requires policy on the government's end. And they now say that they do have a committee dealing with the question of restitution, both of cultural objects and ancestral remains here. But they have been rolling out a plan for how this is going to happen for a few years now. And this is where I think both our politics come into play at the exact same time, where you're saying there's a window that has presented itself for this to actually get policy, politics, and institutions on board. And if we all don't move with the window of opportunity that has been offered to us, there's a very strong possibilities that this might take 100 or 200 more years to iron out.
I wonder then if we should wrap up.
Sure.
Yes, thank you so much.
That was our conversation. We really recommend that you go and see the film The Empty Grave when it comes to cinemas. And we're working on episode 2 right now, and that'll be out in a couple of weeks.
That's right. The film will be in cinemas on May 23rd. In the meantime, as Peter said, we're working on the next 2 episodes of Dig Where You Stand. You can find us at digwhereyoustand.show or at digwhereyoustandshow on Instagram. Thank you for listening.